So thanks for hopping on, everyone. I prefer these to be a little more of discussion than lecture, so please feel free to unmute yourself and interject at any point. Questions are a great way to go. Let me get this going. So I'm Travis Tache. There are some people on here that I haven't had the chance to meet, so pleasure to meet you. I'm in northern Michigan, up at Petoskey specifically, and we're going to talk about some old world versus new world comparison today. And title of this was 101, so I know we've probably got a good, well, we do have a good chunk of wine professionals here, so forgive anything that's a little basic, and maybe we'll get into some things that are a little complicated too, but we're just going to kind of cover it all. All right. So what makes a wine old or new world? Down to the absolute basics. Old world would generally be wine from Europe, oftentimes with centuries or millennia of winemaking history of Vitis vinifera, the kind of species that's we sell and generally is exactly what we drink. And another way of putting this would be from countries where winemaking originated. So basically all of Europe, but you could also move over to Turkey, Lebanon. They'd also be considered old world, Croatia, etc. New world, everywhere else, basically. So countries that have perhaps a history of winemaking, but maybe not as deep as Europe. And generally countries or regions where winemaking was imported during or after the age of discovery or the age of exploration, which is kind of an ambiguous term, but a while ago. So old world, basically characteristics of old world wines, and please take heed that these are generalizations and don't always apply across the board. If we're looking at Spain, central Spain, we're certainly not looking at low alcohol. But in general, we're looking at wines that have presence of earth or minerality that's noticeable on the palate, on the nose, etc. Less dominant fruit flavors than the New World, so maybe more subtle tones, generally elevated acidity, and generally lower in alcohol. And when we look at why, as far as earth and minerality, that's a good question. We don't really know for certain. There's what we call the problem with earth and minerality, in that it is not entirely understood. We do understand that a lot of old world areas exhibit these characteristics, and there are also plenty of areas in the New World that are exceptions to the rule that do the same. But the best definition we have is that they're sulfurous compounds that are created during fermentation, and also other compounds like geosmin that can come across as earthy potting soil, petrichor, like fresh rain. For some reason, these are more prevalent in old world wines than New World. So now take a look at the New World. Now we're looking at more fruit, generally much more of an abundance of fruit, riper characters of fruit. They can be much more dominant, less or little to no earth or minerality. Again, there's exceptions to this rule. Lower acidity, higher alcohol. The wine growing regions in Europe oftentimes are in marginal climates. They're subject to vintage variation. A lot of New World areas are in places with reliable climates, like Napa, for example. It's difficult for them to have a bad year. Same story with like maybe Australia. It's difficult for them to have a year where they can make balanced wine anymore because it's just so hot. Again, exceptions to the rule. And more just kind of bam, in your face. New World wines. Why? Okay, so climatic factors, like I just mentioned, warmer areas, warmer growing regions, more stable climates, more reliable climates will contribute to higher alcohol, lower acidity, and the little to no earth or minerality, that's also a mystery. There are certainly trains of mind or thoughts that digging deep into soil geology and pH of soil can have an effect on acidity, but these aren't necessarily proven factors as of yet. So Cabernet Sauvignon. Today I'd recommended that you pick up a bottle of Bordeaux, for example, Cabernet dominant if possible. 2/3 of Bordeaux is blended to Merlot, so you generally don't find any 100% varietal wines in Bordeaux. Blending is very common, and you may have a wine that's Merlot dominant. But an Old World red will really just do. Rick's Rioja is going to be wonderful. And Cabernet or dominant Cabernet blend from the New World, really any kind of big red might get this point across. We've got a little video here, thanks to Emily. A little overview of Cabernet. So we'll get into this a little bit more, but we'll discuss that next. Actually, let's discuss that right now. So the family of Cabernet Sauvignon. Starting out in parentage of Cabernet Franc, Sauvignon Blanc gives us Cabernet Sauvignon. It's also half sibling of Carmenere, not to be pronounced Carmenere, it's Carmenere, and half sibling of Merlot also. This is where you're really going to find all of your Bordelaise varietals very closely related, and they all have very similar characteristics also. Apologies. Come back to it here. Sorry about that. All right, where's Cabernet grown? Everywhere. Cabernet Sauvignon is grown almost everywhere in the world. It is the most planted varietal in the world. France leads the plantings, but anywhere from China to Australia to Spain to Italy, everywhere that it can grow, people are growing it. And why? Because of demand. Body of Cabernet. I would put this on the bold end of the spectrum, maybe even a little further up, depending on where it's grown and how it's vinified. It's kind of going to be the furthest towards the bold end of the section, apart from some pretty intense grapes like Tannat or Sagrantino, for example. And a flavor profile. This is a nice little easily digestible thing from Wine Folly. Dry, maybe even a little more dry in that end of the spectrum. Full-bodied wines, tannins are always elevated. Acidity can vary depending on where you are, and elevated alcohol, generally the case too. Okay. Next up, okay, we just talked about the parentage. And we're back to the video again. All right, Cabernet Sauvignon, most planted grape variety in the world. It originates in the 1600s. We know that thanks to some genetic testing done in '96 at UC Davis that determined that. And a very significant and prominent quality of Cabernet Sauvignon and Bordelais varietals is the presence of pyrazines. Pyrazines give us the flavors of green bell pepper, roasted red pepper. In Sauvignon Blanc, it can come off like cat piss or tomato leaf. It's a very prominent thing. It's hard to miss. We perceive and pick up on pyrazines at a measurement of 10 to 20 parts per trillion. So it takes very little for it to be there. If you're smelling a wine that has very, very intense green bell pepper flavors, that could indicate that the grapes were perhaps a little underripe. That's pyrazines have a higher content in the wine when grapes are underripe, or if there was a lot of foliage also. Cabernet Sauvignon is a thick-skinned grape variety. So if you've got a Cabernet Sauvignon that you've purchased and you can see through it, and it looks like Pinot Noir, something went horribly wrong in that winemaking process. The thick skins contribute to the dark color of the wine, clearly. And Cabernet Sauvignon's skins are also very highly pigmented, which also contributes to the color. Cabernet has a preponderance to marry really well with oak barrels, too. In a very fascinating study comparing 21 of the top wines of the world that are Cabernet dominant. Screaming Eagle, Antinori Solaya, Harlan Estate, Penfolds, Bin 707, Cabernet from all around the world, Latour, Haut-Brion. There were a lot of characteristics that were similar. Very often, well, and actually all of them, there was oak barrel usage, significant new barrel usage. When you've got oak tannins and grape tannins, they can combine and form an entirely new form of tannin also, which is quite necessary with Cabernet Sauvignon. It helps to soften the intensity of the grape tannins. You're generally seeing elevated alcohol, moderate to lower acidity, and significant ability to age also. Okay. Next up, Bordeaux. So why Bordeaux? Because Bordeaux is arguably the most important region in the world for Cabernet Sauvignon, if not at least the origin location. Bordeaux is one of the most powerful and successful wine regions in the world. It's always a wonderful starting point if you're just learning about wine. It's a great region to kind of dig your teeth into first. They make a whole lot of wine. 650 million bottles produced each year, plus or minus a good chunk due to vintage variability, which is extremely variable in Bordeaux. We're located on the western coast of France, as you can see on the map there, at the Gironde or Gironde estuary. It's the largest estuary in Western Europe, and then breaks into the Dordogne and Garonne rivers, respectively, from north to south. We consider what's on the west side of the Gironde estuary is the left bank, and on the right side, we look at the right bank. Just to state the obvious for a lot of us, the left bank is more Cabernet Sauvignon dominant due to high prevalence of gravel soils that works quite well with Cabernet Sauvignon. Cabernet likes well-draining soils. And on the right bank, it's more Merlot dominant. There's a higher proportion of clay soils on the east side or the right bank, which Merlot tends to prefer. And there are 6 grapes in Bordeaux that are approved for red production. You've got Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, Petit Verdot. You've got Malbec. You've got Carmenere, which is actually permitted, though it's pretty effectively extinct and Merlot. I believe I named all of them. So Malbec actually, once upon a time, for a fun little tidbit, used to be the main grape of Bordeaux prior to phylloxera striking in the mid to late 1800s. Prior to 1880s, Chateau Lafite was almost entirely Malbec. But when phylloxera came through and decimated the region and most of Europe, when it was discovered that American rootstock is the answer, Malbec does not graft easily to American rootstock, and thenceforth went by the wayside and made way for Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot to become the dominant grapes. If you ever get to try that 1876 Lafite, it's mostly Malbec. Tasting. So most of what we're going to do during this is going to be tasting. And the way I have it structured is we're going to go through the deductive tasting method, which is what I'm intimately familiar with as its reference point for the Quartermaster Sommeliers. Deductive tasting is not a parlor trick. It's not meant to be a way to show off. It's a way to evaluate wine, and that's the main goal, basically. So that being said, let's get into it. So I recommend if you have two different wines, I'm going to suggest that you have two glasses with you also, so that we can kind of go through this and look at them side by side. Do we have any questions or comments so far on any of the information? Okay. Well, in that case, let's dig into it. And I'm very curious as to what everyone's tasting. This is a portion where I prefer participation. So please, I'll be looking for characteristics that you're seeing in your wines, as well as what I'm seeing in mine, so that we can get a broad picture here. So personally, I have a bottle of Les Pagodes de Côte d'Estournel, which is their second wine from Saint Estèphe in Bordeaux. And I have a bottle of Beckman Cabernet Sauvignon from Santa Ynez Valley in Southern California. So I recommend grabbing a piece of white paper. I should have told you these things before we jump into it. But let's kind of just get off to the races. So both of the wines I'll hold in front of you, you're going to look at clarity first. Do they look hazy? Is there a lot of sediments? These are going to be opaque wines. But hazy would be, it's cloudy, it's hard to see through. Turbid is really reserved for wines with major faults. Concentration. So your Cabernets should likely have a very deep concentration. They should be intensely colored. And when we're looking at color, this is where we can see a lot of variation. If your wine has several years of age on it, it might be moving more towards garnet. If it's very old, maybe some brown or tawny. If your Cabernet is youthful, then you might see like ruby red, more vibrant images around the rim here. Secondary colors, that's where you can kind of notice some of the age, the orange, the garnet, brown. And rim variation. Rim variation is when you're looking down at your glass against the backdrop, and you look at the very center of the wine, and then you look at the edge. And if there's a difference in, or a fading in color, then that's an indication of rim variation, which is a sign of age. So the Côte d'Estournel, or the Pagodes de Côte that I have here, is a 2012. It's got 8 years of age on it, and there's pretty noticeable rim variation in it. I imagine Ritz wine has pretty significant rim variation with a 96 vintage. Does anybody else have anything that's a little older?
So Travis, the 96 Rioja was heavily oxidized and no good. So I went and grabbed a Cornas, Jean-Luc Colombo, a 13 Cornas, 100% Syrah. And then I have the Fleur Violette Cab. So
Killer.
big
Right
difference
on.
in color.
All right, so that's room variation in a nutshell. Next, we're looking at extract or staining. So when you take your glass, tilt it down, swirl it, pull it back up, are you seeing the tears or any kind of color clinging into the tears or color clinging to the side of the glass? If the answer is yes, which it probably will be for all the Cabernet, then that's a sign of pretty heavy extract. And that's just an indication that this wine is made with from a grape variety that has a thick skin. It's further confirming that. Next, we're looking at tearing. So if you swirl your wine or just tilt it down and back, you're looking at how quickly the tears fall down. Are they really clinging up to the rim where they kind of form that, that edge? Are they falling down slowly? And that would indicate higher alcohol. If they kind of just sheet down like water or faster, then that would indicate lower alcohol. So I can tell that the Bordeaux that I have, which is probably about 12.5% alcohol, is coming down much faster than the Beckman, which is, I believe, closer to 15. It's a cool little exercise to do them side by side. And is there any gas evident? No. You shouldn't have any bubbles in your Cabernet Sauvignon. If you do, something's wrong. All right, into the nose here. So first of all, you're going to smell the wines. You're going to determine whether there's anything wrong with them. Are there technical faults? Does it smell oxidized? Does it smell like nail polish remover? Is there TCA? Does it smell like wet newspaper, wet dog, damp basement in a bad way? And is there a very significant presence of Brettanomyces? Does it smell like horse's ass and nothing else? That's where you're going to be at there. So my wines are clean, and I hope that yours are too. When we're looking at intensity on the nose, is it very delicate? Are you looking at something that's kind of middle of the road, maybe Grenache-like, or are you looking at something powerful? Is there a lot of intensity of flavor and oomph to the wine? Cabernet Sauvignon will usually come across in the powerful end of the spectrum. And in the New World, it's going to be much more pronounced than the Old World in the Bordeaux that I have, which is a little more, I'd say, moderate intensity. So you're looking at a little contrast between the two here starting to emerge. Age assessment. This is really just determining how old your wine is. Does it smell fresh? Are you picking up primary fruit aromas? Does it smell like fresh blackberry and fresh black pear? Or does it smell like dried fruits or maybe decaying or like desiccated fruit? Maybe the fruit's just gone and all you're smelling are some tertiary characters. In that scale of thinking, your wine is likely either youthful, developing, or vinous. As the wine ages, the fruit takes a back seat or can drop out entirely. So fruit, this is where I'd really like to hear what you guys are getting in your wines. What do you smell?
Pressure's on, people.
Okay. Come on.
I feel like I'm getting raspberry.
Great. Great.
My New World one.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. All right, we're all a little shy.
Just feel free to call on people, I think, Travis. As long as they have wine in front of them, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah. Michael, do you have some wine in front of you?
I do, Travis. I don't have Cabernet, though.
Oh, that's all right.
I have Chateau Michel Casavier.
Some Syrah.
Malshinian, little Grenache and Syrah. So smoke, blackberry, blueberry, nice velvety texture. It does have some oak aging on it, so it's spicy.
Okay, great.
My favorite reds.
Awesome. So I guess the main takeaway to take or to point out here with fruit is that your New World wine should demonstrably show more ripe, maybe even confectionery, bright characteristics of fruit, versus your Old World being maybe a bit more subtle, maybe a little dried, maybe a little more focused on earthy character. I can tell you that my New World Cabernet smells like ultra ripe blackberries and black cherries and chocolate covered and super intense and fresh and ripe to maybe even like overripe. And my glass of Bordeaux here is really more kind of dried blackberry and plum, if anything, and more of a focus on the earth characters. So next we look at the fruit character. Generally in the New World, you're going to find riper versions, a little more maybe jammy, fresh, maybe overripe. And in the Old World, you might see a little bit more of what I'm seeing here as like a dried, almost like potpourri-ish kind of character of fruit. Anybody noticing that in their two wines?
I have Chateau Ballac 2014, and there's actually only 30% cab in here, but I'm actually getting like, there is a bit of like a really, just a fresh raspberry, but there is also the potpourri thing, you know, to use that word you mentioned.
Yeah,
and, you know, definitely floral, but as far as fruit, I mean, I think there is also maybe some dried fruit quality to this as well as fresh. And so I seem to notice that sometimes in Old World, I'll still get some fresh fruit, but it's not going to be jammy, but there will also be another fruit quality underneath it.
Sure, that makes great sense. When we're saying things like red, black, and blue fruit too, to break that down a little further, when we're thinking red fruit, we're thinking of things like strawberry, raspberry, pomegranate, cranberry. Red berries are pretty predominant. We're thinking about blue fruit, we're really just thinking about blueberry. And if we're thinking about black fruit, we're thinking of black cherry, black plum, blackberry, cassis, really just more of those dark and brooding sort of flavor profiles. So we've covered some fruit character. How about non-fruit characteristics? There should be a little difference here from your Old World to your New World. For example, non-fruit characteristics would also, for my Bordeaux, I would get things like cedar, like underbrush, some crunchy leaves, like potting soil, and that potpourri, some little bit of like saddle or leather.
Travis?
And yes.
As long as it's not the south end of a mule going north.
So all of, the tertiary should be a little easier to pick out in your Old World wine. And your New World wine, for example, my Beckman Cabernet, I don't get any earthy or funky characteristic at all. It's really just dominated by bright fruit and is super intense.
Would like cocoa and chocolate flavors be considered, would that fall under non-fruit?
Yeah, that would fall into non-fruit, and those are going to be indications of oak aging specifically. But yes, those are non-fruit. So all of your oak indicators, if you've got Cabernet really oftentimes, well, generally always has some kind of oak contact with it. You'll be looking at characteristics like sweet baking spices, vanilla, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, cardamom, vanilla. Vanilla bean would be more French oak. Vanilla extract can be a sign of American oak, coconut, dill, also in that camp. But all of those kind of baking spice characters are indications of oak usage on your wine. So moving along to the earth and minerality, that's basically what we're just talking about in our old world wine. Hopefully you're picking up a good chunk of that. Minerality is generally, in a general sense, pretty non-existent in Cabernet Sauvignon, whether old world or new world. That's just part of its varietal character. And again, those oak characteristics we just talked about. If it really smells like all those baking spices, you could be looking at new oak usage. Sometimes there's a mix of new and old. Small barrels will impart more of that baking spice flavor than large barrels. And French and American oak, it's kind of a blurred line nowadays, but French would be a little more refined, American a little more slappy in the face. French oak is more common with Cabernet Sauvignon. All right.
Travis, a little bit of a question just about oak usage. Is Spain and Rioja the most well-known region that is traditionally using American oak? Are there any other major growing regions that you know of that are using a lot of American oak in the old world right now?
In the old worlds, not that I would really say off the top of my head. Maybe lesser known areas in Eastern Europe due to the cost, but no, I'd say it's pretty much a staunch tradition in Rioja, and that has roots in history due to former trade routes. But yeah, apart from that, not particularly.
How about sherry?
Something other than French oak, you'll more commonly find something like Slovenian oak or oak from Eastern Europe sources. But Rioja had a big popularity in America once upon a time, and Spanish wines as a whole, and that's generally why we see American oak all across Spain. Ribera del Duero, other locations in Spain, yes, you'll find American oak too.
To Travis's point about Eastern Europe, when I visited a few wineries when I was in Croatia, and quite a few of them were using American oak or Slovenian was the two most common that we saw there, because they were relatively lower budget, so they didn't want to use the French just for the cost. But Caroline was also wondering if you could repeat those flavor and aroma differences that you'll get between French and American oak again.
Yeah, so for French oak, you're going to find more refined things like vanilla bean, cinnamon, nutmeg, clove, allspice, cardamom, maybe just smell like your pantry, if you will. American oak is much more brash, in that instead of vanilla bean, it'll smell like vanilla extract. It's less on the refined characters of those baking spices, more on that, and also notes like coconut and dill can be common in American oak too. Very famous winery in the U.S. that uses American oak on its Cabernet Sauvignon would be Silver Oak. Though they're starting to introduce some French oak in their wines. That's a great example. Also worth noting, French oak is 4 to 5 times as expensive as American oak. So if you're slapping French oak on something, the bottle of wine at the end, if you're using new oak, is going to be inherently expensive. That's just the way it is. So now for the fun part, let's taste the wine. So getting into sweetness, for example, you should be looking at dry to bone dry for all your wines. Depending on what you have in front of you, if you bought a California Cabernet or perhaps something from Australia and it was sub $10 or sub $12, you might find some residual sugar in that wine. And that's just, the reason for that is generally engineering for the American palate. Most Americans have we're raised on sugar and we're accustomed to it and we like the taste of it. And sugar up to 4 to 6 grams per liter is pretty much imperceptible, but it adds a kind of richness to the wine. So there might be a little bit there if you bought you know, that bottle that has some. So looking at fruit characters on the palate, you're basically just confirming what you had on the nose, because what you taste is what you smell. So the difference here is that in order to determine wine coming from the old world or wine coming from the new world, it's on the nose. Is the fruit character ripe, for example, or just ripe? And from there, does it move to a tartar end of the scale? Does it move towards just ripe or underripe or perhaps tart? That's going to be an indication that you're in the new world with the wine you're tasting. If the aroma was just ripe on the nose and now on the palate it's turning into ripe or overripe or jammy, that's going to be an indication that you're in the new world, basically. So palate perception is a huge difference. Huge way to kind of pick apart the differences from the old world and the new world here. All right, hopefully everyone's tasted their wines. So for the fruit character in my Bordeaux, it was decently ripe on the nose and it's moved towards just ripe on the palate. And for my California Cabernet, it was ripe on the nose and it's really rich now on the palate, more towards just slightly overripe. Which is really kind of cementing that difference. Now my Bordeaux tastes underripe and my California Cab is rich. So again, looking towards, yes, we mentioned fruit characteristics. Whatever you were smelling is probably what you're going to be tasting. You're basically just confirming things at that point. And the same story with your non-fruit. You should still be getting, if you picked up on some vanilla or toast or smoke, those things should still be there on the palate. But this is also an opportunity to find things that maybe weren't there on the nose. Maybe something that's more present on the palate that you're picking up on that maybe you didn't on the nose. Is anyone finding something that they pick up on the palate they didn't on the nose? Chuck, are you finding anything?
Well, one thing I didn't want to kind of stray off of what you were just saying there, but one thing I'm in my California. So I have this Oblivion Cabernet Sauvignon from Paso. This is a sample that I got from our friends at Triben, who have a few cabs that they make from California, and kind of knowing their style and knowing what that is. I'm also sort of pleasantly. I'm getting that residual sugar that you were talking about before, and maybe some of these bigger, more engineered Cabernet Sauvignons from California. But I'm also getting, which is kind of pleasant, a little bit of addition of a nice acid balance, which almost seems a little bit too much. So, you know, I think with a kind of I'm assuming maybe there was a little bit of kind of an acid addition to this to balance out the sweetness side of it. Can you talk? Can you talk to that kind of that addition of acid sometimes in a wine to balance it out, to give it a little bit less of a one-sided push?
Yeah, so it's a very common thing. Yeah, acidification in wine is more common than you would think. But basically, I mean, if your growing season goes a little long, your acid's a little low in the end wine, just going to let that go. You can determine pre-fermentation where your alcohol levels are going to come out at, where your sugar is going to come out at if you let it go until completely dry, or if you leave some in there. And you can calculate where you should have your acid at in order to have a harmony or a balance of all of those things. So, for example, at Casa Santos Lima, the producer of Colossal, Confidencial, the Portugal red blends that we make, they're a very big winery. And they do add things into their wine, a little more engineering, if you will. And a common theme that I found across the board is that generally the wines were high in alcohol, had a little residual sugar to them, were high in tannin, and had acidity pumped up too. And basically, they're just putting a megaphone in front of that wine. And that's what makes them, you know, very popular. Those wines are intense. They kind of scream at you, and it's done that way for a very specific reason. And
yeah, I certainly can't say it's an unpleasant experience, because it is, you know, engineered or non-engineered. You know, the balance is nice and the balance is there. So it's kind of a, you know, class in itself of just the experience of what you'd want. It's not too overripe, not too jammy. You know, that balance is there. There's something slightly maybe unnatural about it, but it is just an interesting experience.
Yeah, if you acid adjust your wine prior to fermentation, there's no possible way to tell that acid had been added apart from just knowing that it shouldn't be there.
Yeah,
it's not perceptibly different if you acidulate before fermentation. If you do afterwards, it is noticeable. But it's very easy to calculate where all your levels are going to land at prior to fermentation, and to adjust accordingly. Basically everything, the vast majority of wines you're going to pull out of Southern Australia, for example, are going to see acidification. Sherry, for example, all sherries are acidified. It's a category that wouldn't exist without acidification. So it is common. And there are areas where quite the opposite is necessary, like in the Mosel in Germany, where acid levels are screaming high, that you have to have some sugar in that wine to balance it. Otherwise, it'd just be like squeezing lemon juice into your mouth. You kind of have to look at it, the acid sugar balance, as like lemonade, for example. Tons of acid, tons of sugar, but they're balanced, right? So you can't have one without the other. Without the lemon juice, it'd be cloyingly sweet. So the balance is what we're looking for, and that goes across the board for acid, sugar, tannin, alcohol, basically.
I have a quick question, and we also have a question queued up in our chat. Did you say before that the pyrazines, would that be more commonly present in Old versus New World, or does it really vary?
Yeah, it would be more present in Old World wines due to more marginal climates. You would see less ripe styles of wine versus if you go to Napa, for example, the pyrazines may come off as like roasted red pepper, or something not as like in your face as green bell pepper. If you really want a great example of pyrazine in a red wine, grab a bottle of Chinon or some Cabernet Franc water. Really, really intense stuff.
Because pyrazines are only present in some specific grape varietals. That's not like a vinifera quality, right?
Correct.
Across the board.
Pyrazines are basically isolated to Bordelais varietals. So your Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Petit Verdot, Malbec, Carmenere, and in the resulting white grapes, predominantly just Sauvignon Blanc. Is going to be really the only white wine you find pyrazine. Yeah,
because I'm definitely getting it more on the Chateau de Moulin than I am on the Federalist. So I was curious if that was because of the regions.
That's exactly
and then
great.
Okay. We had the question in the chat was, in your experience, do you have more difficulty distinguishing the nuances in wine varietals and regions with older vintages as opposed to newer? So if you had a flight of 30 years old bottles of Cab versus Merlot versus Syrah versus Grenache, is that more difficult than if they were younger?
It's extraordinarily more difficult. When you move towards wines that are in excess of maybe 20 years old, it's really kind of a crapshoot. It's really tough to pick out what it is. You know, you might call old Chateauneuf Barolo, or like you'd think these things sound so drastically different, but after 20, 30 years, it's very difficult to pick out differences. Basically, all of your fruit is gone at that point. You're looking at a similar set of tertiary characters. Sure, the wines are noticeably different, but doing it blind, very, very difficult.
Okay.
And also, when you're determining a vintage, once you move past 15 years of age or so, you got to give yourself a huge range.
It's just old.
You can mistake a 20-year-old wine for something that's 40 years old. Or it's kind of like a big peak and then a very slow progression. The slower, the longer you go.
All right.
Yeah.
We have a couple more questions lined up in the chat now. Anne says that she's made the observation that in her Bordeaux, she's noticing the fruit is less ripe on the palate than it was on the nose, and that she notices this consistently in older world wines.
Yes. So generally, you're going to be finding that the fruit on the palate is going to be less ripe than its perception on the nose. Yeah. So shifting from the nose to the palate, it should go from whatever quality of ripe to oftentimes less ripe than whatever that initial point was on the nose. Yeah. And you'll find vice versa with New World wines.
Very cool. And then we have a question from Rick saying, can you talk about decanters and aerators and how they pertain to tannin, particularly in a high tannin wine like Cabernet?
Yeah. Specifically with tannin, I don't have a ton to say about that. I can say with young, powerful wines, aeration and integrating oxygen through like a splash decanting can be very beneficial. Basically trying to soften the thing in any way you can. I don't know any specific science behind how that might soften tannin, if it actually does. Perhaps it's other characteristics in the wine that are interacting with oxygen that comes off as a perception of softer. But I can't speak specifically to that.
Cool. And then we've got another question from Anne asking, is acidity just a sensation, or is it considered a flavor as well? And that she sometimes thinks of acidity level how she perceives fruit quality, whereas a high acidity would mean like a more tart fruit. And is that just an association, or is there something kind of scientific behind that?
Yeah, it's an association basically. So yeah, acid, we're basically just looking at levels, but drawing that association of like maybe like a green apple like acidity versus whatever, like an overripe apple, they have different feels to them. And also different specific acid levels, but it's generally just a measure of pH is what we're looking at here. There is like very small amount of citric acid in wine, but it's the different types of wine are pretty negligible. One thing that does take place in most red wines and in some white wines is malolactic fermentation, which is changing your malic acid to lactic acid. And malic acid is the kind of acid that we find in green apples, that kind of tart sort of thing. And then lactic acid is the acid that we find in milk. So softer, a different kind of perception there. If a wine has undergone malolactic fermentation, then the perception of that acid will be significantly different because you've shifted from malic to lactic acid. That's most common in like New World Chardonnay, for example. They'll almost always go through malolactic fermentation. If you're looking at like German Riesling, malolactic fermentation is a very uncommon thing there, and that's where you find really, really biting acid. So maybe tasting those two side by side, or one that's gone through mallow and one that hasn't, is a great way of picking those two out. Okay.
I have a question. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, please.
I have a question about kind of old versus new world and how the age can interact with that. So just to explain, my Bordeaux is a 2018, it's pretty new. And then I've got this California Cab that's a 2015, so it's a little bit older. When I taste them separately on their own, the Bordeaux tastes distinctly old world to me, and the California tastes distinctly new world. When I started to compare them, I feel like some of those, especially when it comes to fruit quality, I feel like the age on the new world is masking a little bit of that like jammy overripe characteristic, whereas the freshness of the fruit comes through on like the youth in the Bordeaux. And when I start to do them side by side, I find myself getting a little off track.
Sure. Yeah. So when you have age on a wine, fruit is going to fall out. So if you're tasting a brand new vintage Bordeaux and an older vintage New World Cabernet, you may have a little bit of a seesaw there in terms of flavor profiles.
Mm-hmm.
But what should carry through is the evidence of earth character
Mm-hmm.
and that slightly tartar fruit character in your old world wine, versus even though some of that fruit is dampened down with your California red or your New World red, that should still be the most dominant factor. If you're not getting much for earth character in your California wine, then it should still point you in that direction.
Yeah, for sure. And even with the fruit not tasting quite as ripe, it still was more on that like red fruit terp. It was cherry, raspberry, you know, more on that side of the spectrum. Whereas I still got, even though it was fresh, it was deeper, darker fruits from the Bordeaux as well.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Right. Okay, so we've really just got the structure to go through, and really, I'd recommend tasting your old world wine and then tasting your new world wine, and instead of droning on through medium minus, medium plus, acid, alcohol, tannin sort of thing, it should be noticeable that your old world wine should have more acid, perhaps less alcohol, less heat on it than your new world wine. So let's try that out. Yum. All right, so my old world wine has elevated acid to it. They both have about the same level of tannin. Cabernet's Cabernet, regardless of where you grow it. That's going to be a common factor. But in terms of the climate, the more moderate marginal climate in Bordeaux has carried through into the wine having more acid, less alcohol to it. The New World wine has pretty diminished acid to it, and I can tell it's got a lot of alcohol. It's pretty hot and comes off as rich, full-bodied. So where you judge your alcohol is going to judge where the body is too. If it's higher in alcohol, it's going to have a fuller body to it. Okay. Texture and balance and length and complexity, these are all factors that don't necessarily relate to old world versus new world. It's just determining complexity, how many notes are you able to pick out from the wine. Length and finish would be how long does that wine linger on your palate. Generally, the longer the finish, oftentimes correlates to the quality of the wine. In terms of balance, is something out of whack? Is there something that really sticks out and is hard to get past? That's where you'd find something out of balance, and that's just a textural feel. Any questions on that? Because I think that's all I got.
It looks like we do have another question in the chat saying, yeah, I know you were talking about tears and legs earlier. Everybody always hears that some people say it's from residual sugar, some people say it's from high alcohol, and can you definitively put a nail in the coffin on that one for us?
Yeah, so So it's determined now that that tiering has no relation to residual sugar at all. It was commonly believed that did play a factor, but that's not. It's not true. Alcohol is the one direct relation to the formation of the tiers, how long they're hanging out up top, and basically the way that they move. It's judgment of alcohol. Not long ago, it was under a belief that sugar played into that, but it's been proven otherwise.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember when we did our blind tasting at the office with Travis, he told us if we ever wanted a really great example of that, to take like a glass of whiskey or something really high alcohol and watch the tears and the legs form on that. And I went home that night and tested it out, and he was definitely right. So it's just an interesting experiment you can do at home.
Absolutely.
Cool.
Great. Now I'm curious what everyone was drinking.
Everyone hold up your bottles.
I'm gonna try and get out of this mode. Yeah.
We're twins.
Let's see, Chateau Milan.
Yeah. Chateau de Milan, and then this Oblivion Cabernet Sauvignon from Paso Robles.
Cool.
Both 2018 vintage.
Black and Kamomi, that should be a pretty stark difference.
Oh yeah.
Oh wow, yeah.
Reserve Sake Mark and Ravana. Pretty solid difference there, Art. Yeah.
Oh, Jordan, I was about to ask what you were drinking, and then I realized that was your profile picture and not your video.
Wenti and something, I'm not sure what that is.
Oh, wow. Nice.
Yeah, sorry, I thought I'd take my video down only because I'm not really drinking. My palate isn't really awake at 11 o'clock.
It is a little early for you over there in Washington.
Awesome. Well, I hope this was helpful in some form. I'm showing a
That's
little
good.
in the world.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Travis, for taking us through all of this and sharing your knowledge with us and teaching us a little bit about some of the nuances between these two areas.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
Is next.
Thanks, Travis.
Yeah,
Good to see you.
likewise, Art.
Yeah, good job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If
Mike.
anybody has any remaining questions, or if they think of something that they wanted to ask that they didn't think of now, I've got all of Travis's contact information too. I'd be happy to put you guys in touch. So you can email us at info@kindredvines.com. Or I know a lot of you found the event information through Facebook. You can message us on Facebook too, and I'll make sure that you guys get in touch and he can answer those questions for you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Emily.
Thanks, Emily.
Good to see you.
Thanks,
Yeah.
everyone.
Hi, Art. Good to see you, Art.